Welcome to our Dream Deferred, a podcast that asks big questions and engages remarkable minds from a wide range of fields to help get underneath our unfulfilled American dream. I'm Tracy Waring-Evans.
And I'm Karen Heller-Key.
We're colleagues working in human services, a field that works in every community to ensure Americans have the building blocks to achieve well-being. People in our field work to remove the barriers that get in the way of well-being, and that means getting to root causes, including the ways our shared beliefs, culture, and social systems and structures make it difficult or impossible for people and groups to ever achieve the stability and prosperity we all want and are promised. These past few years, as our country has become more fragmented and long-standing biases have come into plain sight, we've searched for ways to understand what we're experiencing more deeply and to benefit from perspectives that can help us envision a path forward. Our Dream Deferred is our way of engaging with important and diverse voices and bringing them to our field and beyond. Across Season 1, we will weave conversations into a picture to help us see anew where we are, how we got here, and how we can find a new way forward. Today on our Dream Deferred, Karen and I are honored to be joined by author and historian Tim Snyder. He is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Author of numerous books, his latest bestseller, On Tyranny, has recently been released in a stunning new graphic edition. We invited Professor Snyder to help us name some of the most dangerous forces working against our democracy and what they mean for the public good in our field of human services. Drawing on his deep historical knowledge of authoritarian regimes and the ways in which those movements have undermined democratic republics, we seek to make meaning of what's happening here in the United States and to help us translate that understanding into concrete action that advances our collective work, builds common ground, and protects our democracy. One note before we begin. My co-host Karen has a deep personal connection to Professor Snyder's work, as her family lost many members who were murdered in the Holocaust. Stay tuned after the interview for a segment where Karen shares a perspective and a letter from the past from her family's lived experience. Now, welcome to the show, Professor Tim Snyder.
Okay, my name is Tim Snyder. I'm a historian. I teach history at Yale University, and I've written a good number of books about the 20th century, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. But I think the book we're going to be talking about today is On Tyranny, and its new, updated, and beautiful, if I can say so, graphic edition.
Thank you so much. And it is quite beautiful. And we're excited to be able to share and explore a little bit more with you. And I think drawing on any of your writing will be very useful for the conversation. So we like to start with a question about dreams, your own dreams, and the American Dream Deferred, which is at the heart of our podcast. And we explore this with every guest we bring forward. So growing up, can you tell us what a big dream you had for yourself and how your dream was related to, or perhaps more directly affected by, the state of the American dream?
I think I got lucky. I think I kind of grabbed the ring, the golden ring at the last moment. I graduated from high school in 1987. And I think that even like 2, 3, 5 years later, it was already tougher for kids to do the things that they wanted to do, not to mention 10 or 20 years tougher. For me as a kid growing up in the Midwest, growing up in Ohio, I think my clearest American dream memory has to do with the bicentennial. I remember the bicentennial as being not just July 4th, 1776, but a kind of whole year celebration where even the fire hydrants in my neighborhood were painted patriotically. And that made a big impression on me, and the whole idea of a bicentennial and my country being old and having this history of freedom. And I think, the dream that I had for myself was that I could be an American. And that turns out to be more complicated than I understood as a 6-year-old at the time. And I look back at that moment, like collecting stamps. I was a stamp collector as a little kid. And for 1976, the US issued a Liberty Bell stamp, which of course I had and everybody used at the time. I can remember that stamp on letters in my grandparents' house in the countryside where we went that summer. And the Liberty Bell, the funny thing is the Liberty Bell is only called the Liberty Bell because of the abolitionists. When it rang in 1776, it was the State House bell in Philadelphia. It became the Liberty Bell because of a dream of making America freer than it was. So to try to wrap up, I feel like I was lucky. Like I have been able to live quite a free life in the US, and I've been able to be the things that I wanted to be. It's this business of being an American, which I think turns out to be complicated and tricky, like being a member of a society where everybody who's an American feels like they're an American and feels like we're part of the same story. We're a long way from that.
So in this podcast, we are exploring what we're experiencing in this country by trying to get beyond the pat explanations and sound bites that we hear all the time to get to a deeper understanding. And for us, that involves bringing disciplines to bear that offer rigorous ways of thinking and also help provide more context for our listeners. And we're particularly interested in helping our listeners understand anti-democratic forces more deeply. We know your work as a scholar of the Holocaust and Russia and the Baltic states, and obviously those areas have much to teach us about this subject. And your newly re-released book on 20 Lessons from the 20th Century on Tyranny, the beautiful, wonderful graphic edition, that's for us really about the history that's currently unfolding here in the United States. We wanted to start by talking about why the study of history matters. So many Americans say they're fascinated by history, but that sometimes turns out to be more about nostalgia for an imagined past than about what really happened and what it might mean. So could you help us understand what the discipline study of history really is and how it can help us to understand what we're experiencing and orient ourselves to what to do about the current realities?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I appreciate it because I think history in particular and the humanities in general are not taken seriously enough. And they're not taken seriously enough precisely because they're important to democracy. So the people who would like for us to have something besides democracy are keen to move discussions of values and discussions of facts off the table so that all that's left is feeling and emotion and impulse and propaganda. So, I mean, to be a historian, to answer it that way, involves learning what other historians have written, and it involves making new contributions by not only mastering the historiography, we call it, the books that have been written, but also by going to archives and reading sources and taking the time to put them together. So history is obviously an art because it involves writing well, but it's also a science in the sense that you start with a hypothesis. Your hypothesis is based on the other books that you've read, your own intuitions, and then you go into the archives and you find out that you were wrong. And that's a very important part. Like just as a scientist goes into a lab and finds out that she's wrong, a historian goes into the archive and finds out that he's wrong, that the question wasn't exactly the right question. You have to ask a different question. The sources are telling you that there's a different question that's more important. And so you keep doing that. You keep changing your question. You keep going into the sources until you figured out what the real question really was. And then you answer it as best you can. So history is not what you think happened. Even professional historians start with a guess or like a hypothesis, I would prefer to call it. And then you do your best to find out. And at the end of that labor, you have something to say. A good history book, therefore, is always a little bit uncomfortable. It can be a pleasure to read. It can be energizing in the sense that it can help you see the world more clearly, but it's always going to be uncomfortable. It's always going to be a little bit surprising. And that's the difference between history and what people sometimes call memory, or at least political memory. So political memory, like to go back to Liberty Bell, like in our political memory, I'm sure it was called, I think probably all Americans or most Americans would say, well, we rang the Liberty Bell in 1776. I mean, putting aside the question of whether it was actually wrong, which, but which it may not have been, but it wasn't the Liberty Bell. It was only called the Liberty Bell because of slavery. And then if you put that into the story, then the whole thing about 1776 and what 1776 means and what independence is and how free of a country we were takes on a completely different cast. right? That's a very simple example, but history is not, it's not about being right. History, like democracy, is a form of reflection. It allows you, it enables you, it almost requires you to revisit and to check what you already thought. And history makes you do that because if you think like the good people always won, or the wars we fought were always good, or we always won the wars we fought, or whatever it might be, like all the always and the nevers, all the clear things that you think about your own history, we were always in the right, we were always innocent, all that stuff. If you test that against what actually happened, you'll realize, okay, that wasn't the way it was. The way it was more interesting and more human. And if you learn from the way it was, 3 good things happen. The first is you get into the habit of checking yourself, which you need to do in democracy. Democracy is about self-correction, or it's not about anything. The second thing the good thing that happens is that you're less likely to be fooled by your leaders, because your leaders are going to give you a story. They always give you a story about how people like you were innocent in the past. Things used to be great, and somebody came and took it away, right? And if you don't know any history, you're going to fall for that story every time. And the third good thing which happens is that if you know more about history, the future is also more interesting, because when the past is richer and more variegated, then you're able to look at the future and you're able to say, well, there are a whole lot of things that could happen that we can't really imagine. Like it's actually, there's a horizon out there which is broader than we had understood. So those are some of the ways that history is important for democracy.
So you've described in a vivid way the good things that happen when you do truly study history in a rigorous way. You also write often about the dangers of seeing ourselves as individuals and as countries as outside of history, and as seeing ourselves as either on some kind of inevitable path of progress or as somehow eternally victimized. And wonder where you see the United States today in terms of how Americans understand ourselves relative to history.
I mean, first of all, I miss history a lot. Like as someone who teaches it, I wish my students knew more of it. I come into their lives. I mean, I teach really good students. I teach at Yale, but I'm coming into their lives very late, and at the end of their education, not at the beginning. And I just wish they had more of it. And I wish that they had found reasons earlier in their life to care more about it. Because a lot of my students decide they like history thanks to my classes or thanks to my colleagues' classes. And that's wonderful, but like it's too late in a way. They've already gotten into their minds the idea that history is boring and it's predictable and like it's just names and dates and it's just wars, won or lost. And that is unfortunately kind of the way authoritarianism works. Like it makes you think history is really boring. And then later in life, somebody gives you a story about how you were innocent and how the other side was guilty, and you're kind of defenseless against that because you never really got into history when you needed to get into history. You never realized how enlivening it is and how controversial in the good sense of the word it is. You never saw it as a way to reflect on things, and you also just didn't learn enough. So in the US, what you're talking about is like it's a contest which is underway. I wrote a long piece for the New York Times Magazine about memory laws, which is how I see what's happening in a lot of the US states, where the state legislatures pass laws making it a crime to teach history in such a way that's going to make students uncomfortable. And of course, like that is exactly what history is supposed to do. And in that version whitewashes history in a number of senses of the word. It makes students unfit citizens because they don't actually know what happened in the past, although they think they do, right? And it instills this idea of victim, which is terrible. You can't start from the victim position. You have to start from the citizen position. And maybe it's true that your group suffered more than other groups, but you can't start from that. Everybody can't start from that. So a lot of what happens, like the move that's always made in memory politics is to say it's the powerful who are actually the victims. That's a power claim. We have the power, among other things, to claim victimhood. What happens then to the real victims? Their story then disappears. In these memory laws, it's literally supposed to disappear, right? You can't talk about voter suppression because that might make white people feel bad. Okay, so if you can't talk about it, then where are the people who've experienced voter suppression, African Americans and others, to go with that experience, which is their lives and their parents' lives and their grandparents' lives and so on? Where are they going to go with that if you've just said it's not part of America? So history is good because it doesn't allow you to feel too good about yourself. It allows you to become a much more interesting person, but it prepares you for democracy in all the ways we talked about. But it also prepares you for democracy, like in that if you learn it when you're young, you realize you're in this country with a lot of people who have different perspectives than your own. Because a history which is actually a national history, an American history, is going to have to include a lot of different perspectives that are different from the one that you're being raised in. And that's good practice.
Those are really powerful insights. And I'm pausing for a second because you prompted something for me more on the personal side, which is my mother taught American history, U.S. history in high school. And so for me, that one of my many privileges was to be exposed very early on to, what it meant to teach history. And I also watched my mother at times get in trouble because of the history that she tried to surface and discuss with her students that wasn't always the one that folks wanted taught in the curriculum. And that was much of a learning moment that sometimes I think I don't necessarily even really reflect on enough in understanding kind of what shaped me. So that was a personally felt. So I think if we really want and need to see ourselves as part of history, as on the inside of history, and what that means, as you said, for the future, right? What will happen, especially in a time like we're in now, when we're seeing such blatant attacks on institutions of democracy that I think many of us in this country never really imagined possible, even if we should have. And so as we work with health and human service agencies across the country in a space that really is about supporting all people, what can the study of Nazi Germany or other anti-democratic movements from a century ago tell us today? And more importantly, what can it help us know what to do about it?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. That's the premise from which I started on tyranny, because although I'm ever more comfortable talking about the U.S. and U.S. history, what I really work on is Eastern Europe, and it's Bloodlands and Black Earth. My books about political atrocity in Eastern Europe are my core achievements, and for me, my core reference points on how the world works, which it's a dark place to start, but it turns out to be a useful place to start. One thing which is very important is that it's all one history. So when you ask like what can we learn from the 30s in Nazi Germany, we just have to start with it's all one history. Like there's only one history really, and we're in the same history as those Nazis and those Jews. It's all the same story, and so the story we tell can't just have us and how we feel like we're different in it. It has to be a history of humanity in which what happens to those Nazis or what happens to those Jews makes some kind of sense to us. And if we can't make it make sense to us, then we're missing something about us, or we're missing something about them, or both, because we're all people and the circumstances aren't so drastically different. I just say that because, like, for me, history involves sources, like we talked about earlier, but it also involves empathy. Like it involves the ability to see yourself into a different time and place. And so the first point is that this is all like it happened, like it's part of history. It's not a movie. It's not a dream. It happened. It's the same history we're living in. If stuff like that can happen, then stuff like that can happen. It won't be exactly the same. Something like that can happen because it's all one history. The second thing is I want to return to your point, your earlier points and questions about being in history. So if you look at both Stalinism and Nazism from the point of view of the victims who left memoirs, there's very often this touching in a sad way moment where people stop greeting you, which seems trivial. Like, what's that compared to being shot in the back of the neck? Or what's that compared to a gas chamber? But the survivors thought it was important. And so I think, you can stop and reflect on it. And what it means is that their neighbors who were feeling the drift of events contribute to that drift of events. So rather than taking responsibility for their own idea of what was normal, rather than thinking like I am in this history and in some sense I'm taking part in and therefore I have to take responsibility for this history, they just kind of went along, which is what most of us do most of the time. And thinking of yourself as being in history is a way to resist that conformism. And that's why lesson 1 of the book is don't obey in advance. And lesson 9, I think it's 9, is stand out. You are in history, whether you accept it or not, you are. You bear some responsibility, even if it's only a little bit of responsibility. You can't get away from that so long as you're alive. And so that means that everything you do has some kind of moral content. So if you look away, there's moral content in looking away. So that's one of the very foundational lessons from that period. And then, there are all kinds of things that one could learn from that period. Like that's the premise of the book. But to make just a general point, it would be something like the rule of law and democracy are actually very fragile. Stalin and Hitler aren't super villains who had incredible powers that allowed them to do what they did. Our political systems are very malleable. Russians in 1917 thought they were starting some kind of constitutional system. Germans in the 1920s had a democracy. They had a party system. They were not living in a world where it seemed obvious that these dramatic things were going to happen, and yet they did. So that sense of possibility, like people get stuck on, it's not exactly like that. And of course, it's not exactly like that. This week was not exactly like last week either. But the fact that it's not exactly like that doesn't mean that this kind of thing can't happen. So the sense of possibility is really important. And then the question leads me towards the negative answer, like that negative possibilities are there, but also that positive possibilities are there too. This isn't what you were asking about, but Germany today I hate to say it for lots of reasons, but it's an incredibly functional democracy. So it must also be possible to dig yourself out of holes that are pretty deep.
So I'm reflecting on what you've shared, and I share with you coming from a dark place in trying to make sense of what's happening in this country from a personal perspective of my family's lived experience in the Holocaust. And I was thinking that, I'm not sure I have the expression exactly right, but the past 5 years are not identical, but they rhyme with some of the experiences that, so part of the genesis of this podcast for me and many of my conversations with Tracy have to do with a sense of responsibility coming from what I know from my family's experience. And so their neighbors did turn on them. And that is how we know what happened to them. So I'm interested in the question about what happens when people aren't any longer anchored to a shared understanding of what's going on and shared methods, and how at that point, any assertion can grab attention and spread. And we know that assertions that trigger fear and anger seem to be particularly contagious. We know from your work that Hitler and his cadre were very effective at promoting a view of the world that was centered on a vast conspiracy. So how do we learn from what happened in Germany to help us be equipped to deal with the latest conspiracy theories that are now animating people in the United States and animating people to oppose vaccination, to attack historically otherized people? What are the lessons we can learn from what happened in Germany?
Yeah. One that I've already touched on is that it can happen here. So we can't treat Nazi Germany as something which is exotic. If those people were in general quite well educated, their newspapers were not worse than our newspapers. So if the idea that the Jews are in charge of the world and the Jews are to be blamed for everything that hurts Germans, if that can take hold there, then things like that can take hold here, and we shouldn't be particularly surprised. The second thing to learn, and this is kind of Hannah Arendt's point, is that people prefer a kind of machine that makes sense of the world to the world itself. So a conspiracy theory is a kind of algorithm. It processes stuff for you. So something happened out in the world and you can plug it into your larger algorithm and then everything makes sense for you, right? People like that. People like that sense of plausibility as opposed to the surprising, unpredictable, sometimes uncomfortable real world that we're supposed to be living in. Which leads to the next thing, which is that democracy is a project, not a heritage. Like, you have to keep working to create citizens who are not vulnerable to conspiracy theories, who are not vulnerable to a tribal leader who tells them that they're the victims, that you can't afford to do what we did in this country after 1989, which was to kick back and say, well, look, there are no alternatives. By default, it's just us. Like, we won. The Nazi thing is over. The Soviet thing is over. Capitalism is going to take care of everything for us. If you do that, then you raise a couple of generations who lack the history, lack the humanities, lack the imagination, and you do it to yourselves. It's not just young people; you do it to everybody, and then you're vulnerable. Then you're vulnerable to the stuff that you've chosen to forget. And then I get the next point about conspiracy theories is we should probably remember the conspiracy theories themselves. And so, like, QAnon, for example, bears a striking resemblance to the old canard that Jews kidnap Christian babies for their blood, right? And so you got to know that, because if you don't know that, then QAnon isn't maybe going to seem as sinister as it actually is. And also, if you know that, it can also help you to start to decode it, so this is about targeting other people and making yourself the victim, but there may be some other underlying anxiety about it, which has to do with children, or something like that. And so if you see that the claim that other people are kidnapping children and somehow exploiting them in some way is common across a century in industrial, complicated, educated societies, maybe you can go somewhere with what's common about those conspiracy theories and do something with them. Okay, last point on this. Conspiracy theories also fill a space that's been vacated. So in Nazi Germany, the Germans had good newspapers, but the Great Depression was very tough on them. And then they had a leader who said that, Hitler, who said that reporters are the enemies of the people, and referred to the press as the Lügenpresse, which we could translate as fake news. It literally means the lying press, but we say fake news, it means the same thing. And then we had something similar. We had 2008. So the press was in decline since 84, basically 1984. But 2008 was really tough on the newspapers. We didn't rescue them. Then we had the double whammy of social media starting around 2010, which took all the revenue away. And then we too had a leader who said that reporters are enemies of the people and talked about fake news. And the result of all that is that most of America is a news desert territorially. Most of the counties in the country no longer have anyone doing reporting. And so that creates a space for fictions, among other things, for conspiracy theories.
So I'm interested if you would speak to separating facts or information from propaganda and myths. And clearly history relies on information, factual information, and is challenged by the widespread use of propaganda. And I'm interested in Jason Stanley's work also at Yale around propaganda and fascism. Journalism relies on factual information. Science relies on factual information. And as you said, we're surrounded by voices that are using the term fake news, attacking journalists and scientists. Is there anything we can see from not just Germany, but also Russia and the Baltic states that helps us think about how to combat that kind of language and also that kind of tactic, really, of attacking journalists, scientists with these claims of fake news and sort of character assassination?
Yeah. I think one thing which is a little different about the present moment compared to the past is the importance of wealth inequality. So a lot of our fictions have to do with basic inequality of wealth. And that's an old point. I mean, Plato made that point, but when it comes to global warming and the attack on science that's related to global warming, that has a great deal to do with inequality, right? Like it's about a few energy companies and about the private fortune of two brothers, basically. And for the sake of that, we have to throw out not only the facts about climate change, but we have to cast into doubt the endeavor of science as such. So I'm going to make a different argument now, which is that it's not an original argument because Plato, Orwell, a lot of smart people made this argument. But if wealth inequality goes too far, you're living in this very strange information universe where some people have megaphones that are just too loud, and other people are reduced to recipients of what happens to come their way. I mean, as far as like lessons to learn, we already talked about one, which is you got to avoid the centralization of media. You have to make sure that not just that there's a widespread palette of perspectives, but also that there are just facts coming in from all over the place. So in contemporary Russia, one of the things which paved the way for the system they have now is the death of local news, as we talked about before. So that's a pattern to watch out for. Sorry, now I'm forgetting the point of the question. I'm forgetting like what you were trying to get at.
I think you've responded to it. This phenomenon of actually encountering propaganda, which I think Americans don't think they have that experience, and yet clearly we have an echo from history of what could only be called propaganda. And so how to sort of think about that and address it.
Yeah. Part of it goes back to history, like to recognize that you've been fooled before, so like maybe you could be fooled again. And you've already answered it really nicely in the way you posed the question. You have to recognize that if you don't think there's any propaganda around you, that means you've been fooled by propaganda. That's all that means, right? Like the chances that like your life has been charmed in some way, or your country's life has been charmed in some way, that there's no propaganda are zero. Therefore, if you don't notice any propaganda, that means you've been fooled by propaganda, and it's time to think again. But so, cultivating, you're never going to, so, equality, cultivating local news, self-awareness that you're vulnerable to this stuff, right? I mean, just to give an example, Americans talk about the free market. That's propaganda. There's no such thing as a free market. Markets only exist thanks to government support. And the way the propaganda of the free market works is that you get yourself thinking the market is free. No. People are supposed to be free, right? And you get yourself thinking, what's really important is that I not intervene in the market. Well, that means you're less free. You've just accepted oppression. You've accepted that somehow capitalism has rights and you don't. Like the things which are often the basic building blocks of your mental world can be just propaganda. And I'm throwing out the free market as an example of that, because Americans say free market all the time. It doesn't exist. It's a shibboleth, and it messes up the way that you think and the way you reason about values.
Yeah, I appreciate that example. I think in the field in which we work, which is centered on advancing greater equity, racial equity, thinking about social and economic mobility for all people, and what it takes, both policy and practice, to make that happen. And I think in the ways that you just talked about, how inequality of wealth can really surface, or descriptions of what a free market, quote unquote, looks like, those are the forces underneath, I think, a lot of what the work of social and human services is trying to work through, that gets caught in a narrative that often becomes something that then is demonized or viewed in a way that is a destabilization, really, of the very forces that could actually be helpful for all of us. And so, any reflections on that further from where you sit?
Well, I mean, from where I sit, I think a lot about freedom. I'm uncomfortable with the situation that we find ourselves in, where the left does some stuff that probably supports freedom, but they don't use the word, and the right talks a lot about freedom, but often what they mean by it is something else, or even something which is contradictory. So my reflection is that these two questions are very much related, because the American view of freedom is often something like, I don't need the government, which is like self-deception, because we all need the government, and we all exploit the government one way or another. But that idea that I'm free if government isn't, for example, organizing healthcare or whatever, that ideology makes everybody less free, in fact, because in order to be free, you have to have certain things taken care of that no individual can take care of alone. like health. You simply cannot take care of your health by yourself. You need nurses and doctors and friends, and you need all kinds of things to take care of health. You can't. It's not like playing hopscotch on the street. You need a whole set of institutions and networks to take care of health. But if you do that, then everybody is freer, because all of us worry less about access, and all of us worry less about our health, and we worry less about our families and our parents and our children, which makes us all freer. So Americans have got themselves talked into this version of reality whereby they use the word freedom, to oppress themselves, basically, by saying that, like, well, somehow if everybody had healthcare, then that would mean that I'm less free somehow. But it would actually mean that everybody is more free. This trap makes me very sad. I wrote a little book which was partly about this, based on my own time in the hospital, where we could all be much more free. Like if we could just agree that we all have a right, for example, to healthcare, that would mean we're all more free, not less free. And yet a lot of people think that freedom means racing to give up rights, right? Like I can't be given a right because I'm going to make it on my own somehow. And that's a propagandistic perversion right there. I mean, that's an end, and one which runs really deep, and which makes this country much less free than it could be.
Your articulation of some of these paradoxes is exactly what we're trying to do, is to get underneath some of these very simplistic ways of thinking about what's happening. Your book on tyranny opens with a quotation from the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, who said, "In politics, being deceived is no excuse." So many of us and our listeners are struggling to figure out a better path forward and what we can do as leaders, as organizations, to contribute to some kind of meaningful change. So I guess my question is, once we see what's happening more clearly, from your perspective, how do we stay anchored to what's real and stay committed to the hard work that's ahead? I know in your book you talk about this is a long path of doing the work to take democracy where it's possible to take it. So how do you think about that, and where do you place your greatest effort and your greatest hope?
Well, the world of facts, the way the world really is also a collective effort. I'm a historian, so I'm like as close as it gets to being the lone adventurer who goes and figures things out. But I'm perfectly aware that what I do depends upon my students having ideas that challenge me, and my colleagues having written books which set up certain problems, and it depends on libraries and the people who staff them, and archives and the people who staff them. And of course, obviously, it also depends upon all of the people who lived and suffered about whom I write. So even in that, like that, you could tell a story about how I'm like off on my own doing this heroic labor of discovery, but it's easier to do that with historians and with other people maybe, but it's totally false, right? Factuality is a collective effort. And so it involves institutions like, for example, reporting. A simple thing is we should all be paying for our newspaper subscriptions and not just reading what's free. When we read what's free, we are enabling tyranny, because we're doing our little part to take away the financial support for the actual labor of finding facts. And then the other thing is, when we're on the internet, we should only be spreading stuff around that was reported by another person, because that helps that other person who is doing the reporting, but it also does our little part to make the internet less insane. So before we spread something, before we repost it, we should make sure that there's actually a human behind it who did some kind of work. And if we can keep to that simple discipline, that will make some kind of a difference. But maybe more importantly, in the real world, it's important to talk about these factual things that we read about, and to establish like a community of factuality, because we do already have the communities of prejudice, and we already have the communities of polarization. But factuality can only keep going when there's some kind of a community behind it as well. For me, that's also like it's a kind of ethical or moral commitment that you are saying, yeah, I believe in truth. Right? I believe in this stuff. It's not all the same to me. It's not, my opinion's not as good as your opinion, as good as ever somebody else's opinion. It's not. There's something. My opinion could be wrong, and yours could be wrong, and we can find out. And then to speak clearly about all of this, like to just get in the habit of speaking clearly, because so much of the way we use American English now, I think, is a compromise with social media, or is a compromise with this idea that all opinions and all feelings have equal weight. And so we're having trouble with the simple declarative sentence of the way things are. We can end with a smile, it doesn't have to be aggressive, but just that habit of saying that, this is what I've learned from where, smile, right? Where did you learn the thing that you just said? It's a big part of this whole Enlightenment project. We would like to think that there's like this, and our tradition tells us this wrongly, that you have an argument and somehow the facts have an advantage and the truth prevails. But that's not true. It's just like, that's not true. Like, that's a mistake. The facts don't really have an advantage. They need our support, institutionally and morally. We have to value truth, both in the sense of being willing to spend money on it and the sense of willing to make an ethical commitment to it, or else it isn't going to rise to the top. It's going to get knocked down. It's going to get beaten by other stuff.
Really appreciate that, and want to thank you for taking so much time with us. Very insightful ways of really crisply, I think, getting to some of the things that we all can do to be more mindful and to really understand the forces we're up against. And so appreciate very much your time. We will look forward to continuing conversations with you. And thank you so much for all you give to you and your students.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Tracy. Very glad we could do it.
As Americans, we're experiencing a level of division and anger across communities and groups that is deeply troubling and, for many people, shocking. There's a sense of disbelief that we've arrived at a place where so many of our fellow Americans seem to live within separate realities, and a confusion over what this means and where to go from here. As we look for ways to understand what we're experiencing and what it means, one important place to look is to lived experience. What can we learn from our personal histories and from the study of history? Though I don't often talk about it, my family has a lived experience of what can happen when divisions deepen and neighbors no longer share a sense of common cause and of care for one another, or even of all having inherent worth and shared humanity. History is often told in broad themes and at a scale that doesn't feel human. To help us understand our choices of what road we head down, it can be important to experience the consequences of one choice made not just by nations, but by communities and individuals. What I'm going to read is a passage from a letter written by my Aunt Ellie in response to my cousin Aaron, who was seeking to know more about our ancestors and their experience. It's the story of my grandmother, Bessie Boyarsky-Heller's family. Dear Aaron, thank you for the family tree. I found it really moving, and I've been picking it up and rereading it ever since it was delivered. When we were kids, our mother, Bessie Bayer Heller, talked often about her life in Russia and her parents and family. Let me tell you what comes to mind about the Boyarskys. Avram Elia, my grandfather, earned his living by leasing tracts of land. It's my understanding that it was difficult or impossible for a Jew to own land in Tsarist Russia. He hired field hands to plant, tend, and harvest grains on these lands. When the grains were sold, he paid for the lease of the land, paid his field workers, and the family lived on the balance. I have the impression that there was always enough for the family's needs. As a matter of fact, my grandmother, Nechama, was very asthmatic, and my grandfather had a new house built entirely of cedar wood in the hope that she would be more comfortable there. There were 12 children, and every fall my grandfather would hire a teacher for his brood to come and live in the Boyarsky house and teach the children. Mostly these teachers were grumpy old men, and the kids used to play pranks on the teachers. Once they glued the poor old man's long beard to the desk while he dozed as he listened to lessons being recited. One year, when my mother was 16, My father, age 18, was hired as the family teacher, and a beautiful romance was born. Belka and Avram were married, and my father left for America to settle in and send for my mother. Unbeknownst to them at the time, my mother was pregnant. My sister Marion was born, and then the First World War broke out, making travel almost impossible. And so Marion was raised for the first 8 years of her life in her grandfather's house. Marion tells of listening to neighbors come to tell of a pogrom in the neighborhood, where everyone was killed, even the little children hiding under the bed. But she remembered, too, running and running in fields of wildflowers and falling asleep among the flowers. Marion remembers our grandfather as being very devout. She awoke every morning to see Avram Elia chanting his morning prayers. He was kind and loving, but respect for parents was a cardinal rule. Sometimes at the dinner table, if something displeased our grandfather, he had only to raise one eyebrow, and there was instant silence until whatever had been bothering him had been corrected. There were cows to milk, cooking and baking to be done. Bread was baked once a week. After lunch, everyone freshened up and relaxed on the veranda. Someone sometimes brought a mandolin, and there was music and talk of Tolstoy. But Nechama was always busy. She would knit socks when she had a little spare time. Nechama grew her own vegetables and was also proud of her rock garden. My mother told me many times how she lovingly whitewashed the rocks every spring. Once after the harvest, Nechama was dividing the potato crop into 3 equal piles. Belka asked what the 3 piles were for, and Nechama replied, one for us, one to be planted for next year, and one for poor people. Avram Elia and Nechama would never dream of leaving their home. All my mother's sisters and brothers who remained behind were murdered by the Nazis. My mother received a letter from someone who had witnessed it. They were driven into the forest, made to dig their own graves, and shot. Thank you again. It's a beautiful family and well worth documenting and remembering.
Our Dream Deferred, Fulfilling the Nation's Promise is an APHSA production, hosted by Tracy Waring-Evans and Karen Key, editing and sound design by me, Brandon Mitchell. Our team also includes Christina Becker, Jenny Hogan, and Jessica Guerin. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.